Thank you all so much for joining us today. We have Dexter Ross here with us today, the Director of International Advising with the International Student and Scholar Center. He's going to do a presentation for us today on international students supporting them through on-campus employment. And then we're going to open up for probably the second half of today's meeting for any questions that you might have, any best practices that you might want to share with the group. But I will pass it off to Drew to get us started.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Appreciate the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. As Amanda said, my name is Dr. Dexter Ross from the International Students and Scholars Center. Forgive the top of my slide deck here. I repurposed an older presentation for today, but I'm going to cover a lot of different aspects regarding our international student population, in particularly our F1 students, though I do know we probably support other international students as well. But we'll cover a variety of topics. A little bit on the HR process, though that really isn't my world. Also then kind of the F1 regulations, some resources, some questions. Then we will talk about some, cultural considerations, right? Because our students are coming from many different cultures and countries around the world. And then, as Amanda said, we'll open it up for questions and scenarios or things of that nature that you've encountered in your work with our international student population. I'm going to start off by kind of the HR stuff, which again isn't really my world, but I'm going to share some of it that I know in working very closely with our international employee management team. So, of course, when a student is offered a position to join as a on-campus student worker, as part of the HR process, they have to complete an online I-9 information section. And then once they do that step one, they then have to make an appointment to produce their, paperwork, so to speak, that permits them to be employed here in the United States. For those of you who don't know, the ISSC does offer I-9 appointments 2 days a week through most of the year, though we do shut that down, unfortunately, during our very peak seasons. But there's many opportunities that HR provides, both in the student services building during our beginning semester rush periods, as well as other campus locations as well. So international students don't have to come to the ISSC to do their I-9 paperwork, but they can through our appointment system. And then they have to create and update their Glacier account. And that, of course, will change in the new calendar year once ASU officially transitions to Workday. But until that implementation is finalized, we'll just talk about Glacier for the time being. But all of this part is not handled by the ISSC. While we may support the I-9 document process, all of this is really handled by the International Employee Management Team that is part of human resources. So we do get a lot of questions about Glacier and things of that nature. And I wish I knew more about it, but I unfortunately do not. But that is something that they have to do as they begin their employment. Some pieces of information that I got from that team recently this week is just some kind of general reminders as far as the days go, is that they are required to complete their or create their Glacier account within 30 days of their hire date. They are expected to provide their social security number to them as well within 90 days of their hire date. And I'll talk more about how we're involved in the SSN process in just a second. We know that sometimes maybe a student delayed going to the Social Security Administration office, whether they went home for the summer and then are just coming back, or sometimes there are even delays with the SSA themselves. That typically honestly happens when a student only officially has one name on their passport. We have certain countries that our students are from where they don't have a first and a last name. And because the US naming conventions are different, it just takes a little bit longer than a traditional student might to get their social security number from the SSA. And then as a student kind of gets towards the end of their immigration status, they start emailing a student about 85 days prior to the end of their expiration date, either one to say you can't work after this date, or if you are not going to be finished with your degree program here at ASU, please provide new documentation to show that your status has been extended and you can continue to work beyond the date that is indicated. But International Employee Management will terminate the employment of these students if they do not do these things. So it's really important that students stay on top of that. I know in hearing from a student about a week or so ago that, they indicated to us that they are the only international student employee in their office. And so their supervisor wasn't as familiar with some of these dates and kind of requirements. And so they neglected to do something on time, and they actually did get terminated by International Employee Management for failing to do it. And they wish that, there had been more guidance given to them. So anything you can do to support that and remind them, have you done your glacier? Have you provided your SSN, or have you started the SSN process? That'll kind of help students stay within these parameters to allow them to continue their employment. I want to go to this slide first, and I should have done this a little differently, but the SSN. So this is the part that we kind of are involved in, because the screenshot here of the letter, we help students have this letter to take to the SSA to get their social security number. Many of you might be familiar with this form already. It is, of course, different than the Brasswing or Connexa offer letter that is provided to the student. And this was worked on in consultation with our local SSA offices here in the Phoenix Valley. And so this has to be provided and signed by both the supervisor or an HR representative within the department and the DSO, and that's someone from the ISSC. Now, of course, we've moved into a world where digital signatures and remote work is very popular, but the SSA offices have remained steadfast that a wet ink signature is required for both the employer and the DSO. So this is a form where you will have to print it out once you've kind of filled out the top portion of it, and then add your pen signature to it and provide the student the original copy of this letter. They'll then submit it in an e-form in our office for us to review. And then we tell the student to come to our office and then get the wet ink signature from our office. And again, it's the original copy so that both signatures are wet ink. Further instructions that will be given to the student, and then they'll go to the SSA to apply for their number. But then when they get the number, they'll provide that to International Employee Management, update their glacier with the information, and they'll proceed forward. So this is kind of a small part within the HR processes that we assist with, and it is related to this letter to help them with an SSN application. Some students already have an SSN if you're onboarding them, so they might not need this letter from you. So it's not always going to happen, especially if it's the student's second or third or job here at ASU. They probably already have their SSN. So again, not required for all. I'm going to backtrack now to kind of talk about the F1 regulations as it relates to on-campus employment. And this language here is from the Federal Code of Regulations for F1 students that permits students to work on school premises, as well as with third-party providers, as I call them, that are providing direct services for students. And the regulation particularly, of course, calls out a bookstore and cafeteria. So in addition to working at ASU, our F1 students are also permitted to work at our full-length bookstores at all of our campus locations, as well as with Airmark at our various food locations. Now, Airmark isn't necessarily the only company, so to speak, that actually employs students. Airmark also has contracts with some vendors. As an example, Burger King and the Memorial Union, they have a subcontract with Airmark. So Burger King will actually sign that SSN letter because they are the actual employer versus Airmark. So some of these restaurants or other food vendors that we see on campus, it's not Airmark itself, but it's through a sub-affiliation with them. So that's why, we limit, or, we don't, but the regulations limit to where these students can work on campus. And they don't need additional sponsorship or anything else to do this. It's written within the F1 regulations. So as long as they're maintaining their F1 immigration status, they are permitted to work while they are seeking their degree program here at ASU. Now, as far as the hours go, and I'm sure we're all familiar with how many hours they can and cannot work during our fall and spring semesters, they are limited to 20 hours per week. During the winter break, spring break, and summer semester, they can work up to 40 hours per week. The only exception would be for any student who is graduating or starting their degree program in the summer. They still are limited to 20 hours per week. And that is just due to the fact that summer is traditionally thought of as the annual vacation of an F1 student. And so if they're starting or beginning their program, it's then not considered to be their annual vacation, which is why they have to maintain that 20-hour limit. Because of ASU's pay periods and all that stuff, the pay week we observe is Monday to Sunday. So they should be calculating their hours worked over the course of those days from Monday to Sunday. And while we'd love to say that they can average them over that 2-week ASU pay period, work 18 hours one week, 22 hours the next, unfortunately they cannot. It is a strict 20 hours per week, or when we get into the breaks, 40 hours per week. And so they have to adhere to that. The unfortunate reality is that even working 1 hour more than they're allowed can result in their immigration status being canceled. And this is honestly the least fun part of our F1 regulations, but also the very clearest of the F1 regulations. It very clearly says we have to terminate a student's immigration status should they do this. For those of you that maybe don't know the ins and outs of the immigration language, we're not impacting their visa when we do this. A visa is a separate document than their immigration status. So we're just impacting their status. And of course, we work with students to obtain a new status should we have to proceed with that termination. We get a lot of questions about the 25-hour average. That is an ASU policy, not an immigration policy. So we can't provide any guidance on how that is calculated and how that is managed. We in the ISSC traditionally will tell students to refer to their employer or human resources for information on how that's calculated. And I actually will address this in an FAQ in some later slides. So I kind of broke this slide down here and when they can work part-time, when they can work full-time. The times that are highlighted in yellow is when they can work part-time. The times that are not is when they can work full-time. So we're now in our summer semester. So that began on Monday through August 18th. They can work. And again, they're eligible to work up to 40 hours. You're not required to allow them to work 40 hours. You know, some departments actually have a smaller limit with their work hours, and that's totally your prerogative, but they are eligible to work up to 40 hours, again, assuming they're not in that first or final semester situation. When we get to fall, again, we'll go down to 20 through the end of the fall semester. Again, winter, you know, up to again a 40, spring semester at the beginning, again, 20. That week of spring break, which is just the Monday to Sunday, again, they can work 40 hours since the school is not in session, and then the ending of our spring semester. We don't allow students to work full-time during the fall break and Thanksgiving break because those are not full weeks. And the calculations of managing, oh, well, I can work part-time 3 days and then full-time 4 days. I don't know, I'm not a mathematician and I certainly don't want to go into that calculation. So it's just cleaner to say, you know, of course, throughout the fall semester, they just got to stick to that 20-hour limit. I got a question earlier this week, and it was a great question. You know, who is expected to monitor their hours? And ultimately, the responsibility is the student. It is their responsibility to monitor hours, to know the hours that they're allowed to work. You're not going to be surprised, but we email students about this all the time. We talk to them on orientation. It's on our web page. So, well, we know students don't read emails and don't always pay attention in orientation. Again, it is the expectation that they know that. As the employer, if you know they work more than 20 hours or 40 hours during the breaks, you can certainly report that to us. The student should ethically report that to us as well. But we in the ISSC are not monitoring it. We don't pull reports from HR or PeopleSoft or anything like that. We're not going to go into your office and asked to see your pay cards and things like that. You know, we trust students are following the rules. If we're not the police, so we're not going to start investigating every student and ensuring that this is being done. But ethically, they should. And frankly, if they don't, it could pose potential issues for them in the future as they apply for future immigration benefits. So they should be honest and work with us as necessary if they do go over their hour limits.
Hey, Drew, real fast, there was a question in the chat. Just for clarification, for a student working over summer, do they need to already be enrolled full-time for the fall semester to be eligible to work for the summer? Or how many credits would they need to be enrolled for to be eligible to work over the summer?
Great question. We have gotten this recently since, of course, we are in summer. No enrollment is required from an immigration perspective to be eligible to work in the summer. That being said, if they are starting a new position in the summer, they are required to have the intent to enroll in the fall semester. I use the word intent very explicitly because that's what the regulations say, that they have to intend to enroll in the next semester. We interpret intent to be either they are enrolled in the fall semester, whether it be they have one class or they're enrolled full-time, or they can also tell us when we get these brass ring connector requests and there's no enrollment, they can reply to our email and say, yes, I have the intent to enroll next semester. And we will take them for their word and then approve that offer. So that's the only time where if they're starting a job in the summer where enrollment does factor in. But again, usually in the summer, they've enrolled in at least one credit unless they have a hold on their account. And then again, we just email them and say, are you intending to enroll? And if they say yes, we'll proceed with that.
Great, thank you.
Yep. So students can work multiple jobs, right? I don't know if there's an HR limit, but we honestly don't care if they work 10 jobs on campus as long as they, keep their hours in check. For stipend positions, great kind of situation that came up in a conference, the one that was referenced on the top of my slide here. What you all do in the HR world as far as how many hours you say they're working to earn a stipend, we don't care about that. We actually care how many hours do they actually work each week. So if a student is earning a stipend and they, put in 5 hours one week, they need to be tracking that. And then if they have another on-campus job that's an hourly position, they should know they only can work 15 more hours. But if the next week for that stipend position, they work 7 hours, then again, if they have that on-campus job, they should only work 13 hours in that hourly position. So it's about hours actually worked. We don't care what offer letter says. We don't care what the HR system says, how many hours you're saying they're working a week to earn the stipend. It's about how many hours they actually work. And again, they just can't go over the hour limit, regardless of how many jobs they have. We went through that. Kind of said this already, when they get the letter signed, they go to the office and then they will update their profile, their Glacier profile when they get their card. Just some things about new students. They can't start working until they arrive on campus. They have to arrive, complete CVIS check-in, enroll, and they can't arrive more than 30 days prior to the start date of the semester. So they may start applying for jobs 3-4 months before they actually get here, but they can't start working until they've arrived and completed CVIS check-in and done that process. For our graduating students, they have to stop working on their program completion date. For most students, that is always going to be our commencement date. This past spring, it was May 6th, just this Monday. So any graduating students should have not worked after Monday. That being said, they can still receive a paycheck after that date. Any RA, TA offer letters that say their offer is through May 12th because of ASU's pay periods, cool. But again, it's about actual hours worked. So they just couldn't work after Monday. For our continuing students, as I kind of said earlier in the slide, Monday was the day they could start working up to 40 hours per week, and they can do that through August 18th. Some frequently asked questions. So I talked about the 25-hour average earlier. From my perspective, at least what I've been told, that's calculated by our ACA compliance team. So any questions about how that might get calculated, I would refer you to them, or if anyone has more information, feel free to add it into the chat. But again, the ISSC cannot answer questions about that. You all may know about post-OPT. It's a work authorization for students after they graduate. And we get questions on whether students who have graduated are eligible for student worker positions. As far as we know, they are not. Only current degree-seeking students are eligible for student worker positions. So they would need to seek other opportunities. Get this question a lot. How long does it take for us to review these Connexa or rastering requests that come in? And this, honestly, at this point only happens when a student doesn't have enrollment, when they're offered a job during a break and that enrollment isn't there. And honestly, it depends on how long the student takes to respond to our email. If we send an email saying, hey, what's your intent to enroll next semester? If they don't reply for a week, we're not going to approve that offer and rastering until they do. J1 students is a very different situation. They always need to get their sponsor approval to be in an on-campus position, which is very different from F1 students. We have a small number of J1 students, but you may encounter some of them. And so it honestly will depend on how long it takes the sponsor to provide us with their approval for us to then authorize that offer. If you have a Fulbright student, that is a J1 student that is not sponsored by ASU, it's sponsored by IIE. The Institute of International Education. They are somewhat notorious for taking a little long to get their approval to us so we can authorize the offer. And so if you have any holds up on those rastering offers, this is probably why we're delayed there. A lot of questions about Airmark and students who may have multiple jobs. They have an Airmark job, they have an ASU job, because Airmark, for some reason or other, does their pay week Thursday to Wednesday, or does their schedule from that. Again, because ASU is Monday to Sunday, we ask that the students just calculate their hours every week, Monday to Sunday. So maybe a little messy with their schedules that are different start and end dates, but they should calculate it on a Monday to Sunday basis. As I just said, student workers can receive a paycheck after their program completion date. They just cannot work. A lot of questions about students who might be doing CPT, which is an off-campus work authorization for usually internships. Of course, summer is a popular time for internships. Can they do an internship off campus and also work on campus as well? The regulations don't prohibit that. It's not explicitly addressed. They are two separate parts of the regulation. We just always like to remind students that studying is their primary activity as an F1 student. And so they should keep that in mind. If a student is doing a 40-hour week internship with Intel and then trying to work 40 hours a week on campus in your office, that's 80 hours of work, could be seen as just being here for employment purposes, which is not the intent of the F1 immigration status. Can student workers work remotely from their home country? Very popular question right now because, of course, we are in our summer semester. Since they're going to be outside the United States, they're not in F1 status at that time, so it's not a question for us to answer. This is actually an employment or a labor issue, and so all of these requests should be routed to the International Employee Management Team. From working with them very closely, I know it depends on a lot of different things. One is the student going to a country where there are economic sanctions because of the relationship between the United States and that country. Iran, as an example. I don't think IEM is ever going to give permission for a student to work remotely from Iran over the summer because of those economic sanctions. The other piece of it could be is, where is the funding for that position coming from? If it's coming from a US grant, there may be some restrictions on what and how those funds can be used. So there's a variety of factors that go into these decisions. I'm going to say, for the most part, and maybe I don't know if Kelly's here or not, but usually they'll say yes if it's like, oh, they're going home to India and we're gonna, work remotely from India. In most cases, I think they'll say yes to that, but you should always double check with them regarding these remote work situations. Finally, before I open up to some questions, just want to talk about some cultural considerations. You may or may not know that we have students from around 150 different countries around the world, and I should say countries and territories. And so that brings lots of different perspectives, right? And in many ways, US culture, and I guess I should use air quotes because I don't want to assume that US culture is also just one way, but it can be very different from some of our students and where they're coming from. So one of the things I always like to remind people of is the notion of time. Cultures have very different notions of what time is. Some believe that time is money. You might say that's a US perspective. Others might say time is life. And there are some other cultures that are like that, right? So while punctuality, being on time for one shift here in the US is very important, and we may have procedures in place for being late and how many times you'll be late, things like that. In other cultures, showing up late isn't a big deal. You know, they're like, I was just 5 minutes late. What does it matter? When I got here, I worked my butt off and I did all the work you wanted me to do, but they were still late, right? And so how do you communicate the expectations of being on time or taking their breaks in a certain period of time, right? Just be clear with those expectations, but also remember it may take some time for them to get used to it, right? A student who's grown up in a country for 20, 25 years and lived in a culture where time didn't have such strict parameters, we can't expect them to come to the United States and then within 3 months automatically change their behavior to be with the notion of how we see time in the US, right? So have some grace when you can, have some rules when you need to, but just know that time is a very different aspect across the world. The other part is hierarchy. Many cultures do have a very deep respect for hierarchy and those with titles or positions higher than them. That being said, I will also say I think sometimes our students show a little less respect to staff than they might to their professors. And so work with that as you may. But they also may not challenge you openly because they want to defer to you and the authority that you have, the position as their employer, right? So they may be indirect with their feelings because they want to maintain respect, but maybe they have questions or maybe they don't understand something, right? So kind of check in with them and see if they are understanding the task at hand, seeing if they have any issues that they want to communicate. When you start that conversation, they're more likely to be willing to engage with you on it. It's when they struggle to, I think, sometimes to initiate the conversation because they don't want to come across as rude or disrespecting your authority or your position. And of course, they don't want to get fired, right? They don't want to do anything that's going to put them in a place where they're going to say, sorry, you know, you have to go, right? So they are going to try and respect that hierarchy as they can. The other idea is language, right? Not only in words and phrases that they might use in their culture. I don't know how many of you might have heard the phrase, I have a doubt. That is a very popular expression for our students from India. And it means I have a question. But they use the word doubt to say, I have a question, right? So you might hear them say certain things and you're like, I'm not sure what you mean by that. And it took me a while to figure out when students would say to me, I have a doubt, that they actually were asking that they had a question. Another thing, of course, is the use of idioms, right? Slang and idioms is not common across cultures, right? Especially in the US where we have many sports related idioms, right? Think about the language that you use and that kind of stuff, right? Just because it might be common for you to say, I hit the ball out of the park. Do they get what that means, right? Maybe not, because it's not an expression that they're used to. That being said, they may use an expression with you that's very popular in their country, and you may not understand what it means because it's not an idiom that is used here, right? So we love to say avoid idioms, avoid acronyms, because they're just maybe not common language that they're used to or that they understand. So be mindful of that as well. The other thing is the idea of negotiations. This is maybe a little bit more of a Drew perspective than an official cultural difference perspective, but I found that students tend to think that if they tell you what their personal circumstances are, that may give them a different result than what you've told them originally, right? There's sometimes the impression that rules and policies can change based on what you might tell them, right? And because their family is so important to many of them, right? They may think that if they say, oh, well, there's a family emergency, can I do blank or can I get an exception to blank? that should say to you, yeah, well, yeah, of course, because your family has this need, and so I'm going to give you that exception, right? So they may constantly kind of ask for those exceptions based on, again, just where they're coming from and what is important to them. And for many, family is the number one priority. And not to say that's not the same here in the United States, but family can extend beyond the nuclear family, like it traditionally does in here in the US. Could be aunties, uncles, cousins, great-grandparents, things like that, right? So a student may be very upset when their second cousin in the world of United States culture has passed away and might need some time off, right? And that's because there's just a deep connection to their family. But again, they also might think that if they tell you this story, that will dictate a different interpretation. And we face that a lot when we deal with our F1 regulations. They sometimes think, well, if I tell you that my parent or someone passed away, you won't enforce the policy of the F1 regulation. And while I wish I could take into consideration personal circumstances, the F1 regulations aren't written in a way that says exceptions can be made when blank happens, right? So I still have to enforce some things, even when I know from a personal perspective that they've gone through a lot or something is really impacting them. So take that into consideration. And then lastly, personal etiquette, okay? One, personal hygiene, right? Again, I think that's a common expectation in the United States that we're clean, we shower, we use certain products to keep ourselves clean, so to speak, right? And again, that's just not common in every culture, right? And so I've had, employees say to me, or not employees, colleagues say to me, one of my students clearly isn't wearing deodorant to work. And it, after the end of the day, there's a smell in the office. What can I do? And I just tell them, have an honest conversation, right? Again, but remember, they're coming from a perspective where that may not be the common thing to do, right? So, well, it's your common expectation that they do that. It may not be theirs. So is there a compromise? Is there an educational moment? Is there an opportunity for changing your own perspectives about what should be done and what should be practiced, right? Personal space as well, right? We tend to kind of view that we have a bubble around us and that bubble should be respected, right? Again, not all cultures have that. Some people might just stand right up to you or come right to your desk and stand right behind you and you might think, oh, you're a little creepy, get a little close there, right? And again, that's just because personal space is just seen differently, right? And then finally, taboo subjects. Generally, I would say that in the US, we except for politics, we tend to be open to talking about anything, right? And that includes sex, drugs, and now my brain is blinking, but other topics like that, LGBTQ, right? And again, those just aren't topics that maybe are talked about as much. They may feel uncomfortable if you start talking about those things, or colleagues or other student workers in the office who have no issues sharing that, right? Some of those topics are just not things that are talked about. So they may feel uncomfortable when that kind of language is being shared or tossed around the workspace. So again, all these considerations, again, are not rules to abide by. They're just things for you to be aware of because they may impact how they respond, how they perform, the conversations you have with them, because they're coming from very different places. And we should also remember that just because you have 5 students from blank country doesn't mean they're all going to act the same, right? As I said earlier, the US also isn't a monolith culture, neither is a singular country, right? And so, there are regional differences, dialect differences, right? And so you may assume, well, yeah, I worked with a student from blank country last year. I know how to work with them, but they may be from a different region. They may be part of a different religion. They may have different ethics, right? And so how do you get to know them uniquely and then work with them through these areas? A question that Amanda got prior to me coming here today was this question, and I didn't feel that it was that I was the expert here to kind of answer this question. And so maybe this can kind of kick us off into the space of a dialogue or other further questions. But as I mentioned, international students are limited to on-campus work. Yes, there are some off-campus authorizations, but it's really when it's particular to the degree program and things like that. They can't just go work at McDonald's or go work at a local restaurant, right? We don't have majors where restaurateur is the focus, right? So how can we promote a more active hiring environment for our international students so that they can also take advantage of employment opportunities here at ASU? So I'll open the floor to that question, or if there are any other questions and things that I've referenced, I'd be happy to have a dialogue with everyone.
And feel free to come off of mute or throw your questions in the chat. Abby and I can either read them out loud, or Drew will keep an eye on the chat. So there's one question: can an F1 student work an internship over summer break?
They can, yes. That would, if the internship is not with ASU, it would be most likely through the CPT work authorization. They do have to get that approved by their academic department. And once that approval is given, they'll come to our office for the actual work authorization. And we'll work through that process. So yes. If they're doing an internship at ASU, because they can work on campus, usually don't really call it an internship. We call it student employment, even if you may call it an internship, because again, it's on campus and they're allowed to work on campus without any additional work authorization.
There was another question, Drew, about in fall and spring, can students work remote or do they need to be on campus? Tammy, I'm assuming that the student is in the US working remote. They're not going home to their own country, correct? Is that what your question is around? Yes. So are there any regulations about working remote during fall and spring, assuming that they're still in the US?
Not from an immigration perspective. Again, I would defer to IEM if they have any rules and regulations about that. But you know, being inside the United States, adhering to the 20 hours. From an academic perspective, they have to be on campus and taking in-person classes to maintain their status. But we don't have any concerns if you're giving them assignments to work remotely from their apartment.
Drew, another question that I've received is whether or not, is there a calendar that you all already have, or is there an email that could be provided with the dates during the semester where the work hours are limited? Is there something already that we could be viewing that will remind us as supervisors when those hours are limited? So like you were saying, I don't, like if there's Thanksgiving break, fall break, like during those types of times.
There isn't to the explicit intent that I think is being requested, but that is something that I've heard recently as well. And so we'll take that to my team. I would kind of say we have our website, which has, you know, more current information, right? It addresses the summer right now and when they can start working full time, but it doesn't go through spring 25, summer 25, all that nature. But I would also say we really align ourselves, or try to, as much with the ASU academic calendar, right?
Yep.
So, but there are some slight differences. So I don't look at the ASU academic calendar and just go only by that. But it is a great question, and it's something I think we could definitely produce. We should probably try and be a little bit more forward thinking, like the ASU academic calendar is, and kind of planning out semesters a few years into the future. So I'm writing it down and we'll work on it, and you can share it out with you both so you can spread to this group when it's out there. And then we'll continue to kind of share it out to our employers' contacts as well.
Thank you for that. I also just received another question, Drew, that I'm interested to hear the response on this one. I had a student worker this past year. They took an internship with an American company over the summer. The student returned to us in the fall, but a month into working with us, that company he had an internship with offered him a job to work with them while he was completing his degree. Was this job illegal while he was a student here?
The internship, I assume they're asking about?
The job that he then accepted while he was finishing his degree.
I would hope not. But
does that
are,
go against their visa if they accepted that position while still finishing their degree? I sent you the message in a direct chat there.
I'm going to make the assumption that they, and this does happen frequently for students who do an internship in the summer. You know, again, I love to use Intel because it's a common with our engineering students, but you know, they'll have their summer internship, and then sometimes either towards the end of their summer internship, or as in this, maybe this example, you know, the fall semester starts, Intel comes back to them and says, hey, we want to extend your internship, or we want to offer you another one. They would hopefully be going through, again, the CPT authorization process, first with their academic department, to get that approval to do a second internship, and then coming to us to get the CPT authorization. So we do authorize CPT during the fall and spring semesters as well. It's less common in those semesters, but certainly it does happen, especially in the fall as, again, these internships get extended, so to speak. So we hope that they had the proper work authorization to work off campus. I don't want you to tell me the student ID because I don't want to look up and find out that they didn't. But again, you know, should they get that work authorization, they can do that. What do I want else say on this? My mind went blank.
Drew, we had another question in the chat. So you talked about how F1s are limited to working 20 hours a week in the summer if summer is their first or last semester in school. Would this be the same for J1 students?
It would, yes.
Okay.
My apologies for not clarifying that. What I was going to say in relation to that comment too, sorry, earlier. From an immigration perspective as well, we don't view ASU staff positions any differently than we would a student worker position. As long as they maintain that 20-hour during the fall and spring and 40-hour during the breaks. We've had students offered what we might call staff positions, totally fine, as long as they, again, adhere to that 20-hour and 40-hour limit. So we can't expand that thinking that it's just on just student worker positions. It could also be staff or faculty, frankly, again, as long as they're maintaining that hourly limit during those times.
Drew, this might be a question for you, but also for everyone in attendance if they have any best practices or recommendations. But how would you support an international student employee who might come to you and they're struggling, just kind of adjusting culturally to the US or to being away from their family, to going to school full time? What are some recommendations or resources that you would connect them to? And again, this is for anyone too. If you have any recommendations or best practices, please share off of mute or throw that in the chat.
I would love to invite my colleague, Haley, who's here with us today. Haley, sorry to put you on the spot if I may. She works in the ISSC and she works in our graduate student initiatives area, but this is a little bit more in her world. Haley, are you available?
Yes, and I was actually just busy writing, sorry everyone, like kind of a paragraph into the chat, so I'll send that in a second. But international students definitely will have different transition periods. So just as a heads up, you know, like the first semester, you might have a lot of students that initially need different kind of help, but sometimes we see, you know, 4, 6, 8 months in is when some longer term cultural challenges really come forward, when students honeymoon stage are wearing off. So there's a lot of different resources that can help support an international student. Everything from the dean's office, where they'll have emergency funds in case a student gets scammed or has some kind of issue, roommate issues, are a common thing for international students since they come over here and blindly pick a bunch of people to live in generally a very small, cramped space. And you can always send them to someone like myself who works with graduate students. And we also have a counterpart of me, Rosita Smith, for undergraduate students. But then also the Dean of Students is a great place, as well as different departments, even like culture at ASU. So if students are needing to find community, suggesting they find student clubs that are either interest related, culture related, or even the Coalition of International Students, there's a lot of different platforms for students to find community and support. I generally suggest for them to reach out to ones that they feel most comfortable with, which is not the most easy, straightforward answer I can provide. You can always just send them to me and then I can meet with them and kind of find out what might be the best solution. But there are a variety, and just as also as a heads up, using different resources like counseling services is not always your most popular, I don't know if popular is the right word, but traditionally culturally accepted pathway to find support. So if you are thinking a student would benefit from using different counseling services, being really intentional about how you bring up that conversation is really important, because that might not be something they are culturally aligned with. And so thinking about, you know, sharing how, oh, this resource might be helpful, I can walk you to it, just for you to find out about it, and allowing them to kind of dive into it, and lending that like extended helpful hand is usually really useful. I just spewed like 4, I don't know, probably 8 different options for you. So please feel free to let me know if you have any follow-up questions for that. And I will shamefully just let you guys know my plug that I'm going to put into our chat. Every semester, we have a networking for on-campus jobs for students, and we ask different departments to just host a table to help students understand the skills and required and or desired skills that are needed for these jobs, when they might be posted, if they are already posted, to connect with students. And that way students can better understand the departments on campus that they might be more realistically interested in getting involved with, and finding jobs that suit them and their interest, rather than just blindly applying to 300 jobs and then having all of us have to read 800 applications. So it's a really an attempt to reduce that and have applications a little bit more specific. So I'm going to put that in the chat with a link if you would like to host a table. We're doing it June. But I also put my email in there if you need to forward me any students, have any questions, or want to find out about specific resources to connect with students, especially if they're having a hard time culturally. Hopefully I got it all, Drew.
Thanks, Haley. Appreciate it.
We still have a few more minutes left. Are there any other questions or pieces of advice that anyone would like to share? An answer to the question that Drew has on screen, recommendations for that?
Or any success stories that you think are important to share? I know sometimes we focus on the bad and the regulations and the rule breakers, but I'm sure you have plenty, or hope you have plenty of wonderful international student workers that have been a wonderful contribution to your department as well.
Okay, I'm just going to share a fun little experience story. I started my ASU time at ASU Lake Havasu. That's where I did my undergrad at, and then started working as a professional at ASU Lake Havasu. For those that are not familiar with ASU Lake Havasu, it is a smaller satellite location about 3 hours north of the main campus here. A lot of international students are drawn to that location for the cheaper cost that it is to go to that location. And I don't want to misrepresent numbers there, but I know a large amount of their population is international students. And as an employee from that campus, I just was always so impressed and like in awe by the international students, and seeing how they all just come together, and the sharing of different cultures is always so fun for me. And I love learning about everybody's cultures. So again, just I love working with international students. So thank you, Drew, for being here to join us today and sharing more insights on how to better support and supervise these students.
I'll chime in again. So it might go without saying that I love international students, since I'm the associate director for all graduate international students. But I can't express how much value they bring to my life. My first and second student worker, one graduated last December and one just graduated this weekend. And I feel like a little part of me is left. But I developed just the most amazing relationships with people around the world. And I really think it provides value to my experience, even with there's some fun challenges, but I always find them more of a learning curve or learning opportunity for myself. And I think, kind of alluding, Drew, to your question of, how can we promote hiring more international students? I really hope, if you have a good experience, to share that with those who are considering hiring an international student, or, sharing my invitation to table at our kind of networking for on-campus jobs to anyone that hires international students or hires students and hasn't hired an international student yet, so they can come and just meet people. It is networking. It's not offering students jobs on the spot or anything like that. But I do encourage sharing great students. And if a student ever uses me as a letter of recommendation, please reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions. I do that a lot. And I even offer a lot of times referrals at students who are my student workers. If there is a management intern position or something that's higher up, I do push my students to climb the ladder a little bit at ISSC. So if I'm ever pushing a student your way, it's because I love them and I really think they're amazing. So I just encourage everyone to give it a try.
Thank you so much, Haley and Abby, for sharing. Does anyone have any last questions, stories to share?
Amanda, I just saw somebody shared in the chat that there's another network event to help other students. Hidden Library is hosting a tabletop game event for international students. Next one is June 12th. So share that out with your working learners or student employees if anybody is still here over the summer. Sounds like a great opportunity.
Yes, and I'll do a plug for our Slack channel that we have for our student employment supervisors. So any of these opportunities, please feel free to share those in that Slack channel. You are welcome to post them. If you would prefer that Abby or I post those opportunities, we're happy to do that too. But that Slack channel is really an opportunity for us to connect and share different events, opportunities, networking, anything to benefit our student employees, or even just each other in our own professional development.
I'd love to just say maybe one more thing, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
We hear from some employers that our international students can be persistent in their request for obtaining an employment position. And sometimes I have to remind myself as well that our international students pay a much larger tuition rate than our in-state and out-of-state students. Many students will take out massive loans and put their families' farms, houses, their uncles' businesses on collateral for those loans. And so there's a lot of familial pressure to obtain on-campus employment, to subsidize their living expenses and things like that they'll need here in the US. And so while they may seem like they're pressuring you to hire them, they're probably getting a lot of pressure from their parents and their family as well, because the financial impact and kind of again, that whole family just coming together, rallying to pull funds to support this one student here in the United States. It's a lot of pressure for them to kind of manage. So, you know, you don't have to offer a student a position just because they've given you a sob story about how much they're paying in tuition, but just remember that when you might feel like they're constantly emailing you, asking about their status of the application, things like that, they're just under a lot of pressure, both financially and from their families, to really obtain these opportunities to help kind of alleviate any of those pressures from a familial and financial perspective.
Thank you, Drew. That's a really great reminder. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us all today. This has been great. I learned quite a few things that I did not know, so really appreciate it. We have recorded today's meeting, so we will make sure to include that in the Supervisor Student Employment Slack channel, and then we'll also be putting it on our WorkPlus website, so if you would like to go back and view it or share it with anyone who might not have been able to attend today. But thank you all so much for being here, and I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday.